Hello, I want to teach you today about finding bees in batches of insect specimens. So if we go out and collect a whole bunch of bugs, it looks like this. And because we're doing bee biodiversity research, we want to just be able to pick out the bees. Seems easy, but it can be kind of tricky. And so in the process of doing that, I'm going to go over an introduction of all of the bee genera found in Pennsylvania so we know what they look like. So when we're studying bee biodiversity, there's two sort of main ways we can do that. First is with observations. That can be just visual observations or with photos. And a common approach for that is to use iNaturalist, which is an amazing service. I love it. And there's a lot of benefits to doing that, including that it's easy. You can have a lot of people participating. You don't have to kill any bees to do it, which is great. There are some big cons to this as well, which is that you have a bias towards big and common species, and that many photos will not be able to be identified to species. That's just the difficulty of studying insects. They're hard to identify, and photos aren't enough. So on the other side, if we do collections, go out and collecting bees, and then we have to kill them to do that. It's potentially a lot less bias because we can sample all sorts of bees and smaller ones and cryptic things. And the most important benefit is that we can get species level identification. So for many studies that are focused on natural history, you really need to know the species, or you're not achieving your goals of studying sort of basic natural history, which at its core is like what species is in what place at what time. There are some downsides, of course. It's quite time consuming to catch all those bugs and process them and label them properly so they can go into museum collections. It can take some specialized equipment. And then, of course, you have to kill the bugs to do it, which is very counterintuitive. We're out here studying bee biodiversity and really loving these things and trying to learn about them, but we have to kill them to do it. So that's unfortunate. But if we really want to do species level identification, that's what we need to do. So if we're going to go out and collecting bees, if our project requires species level identification to reach our research goals, then we need to collect bees. And at least for the bee monitoring project in Pennsylvania, we have three ways that we do that. First is these bowl or pan traps. They're colored bowls with soapy water in them, and bees and other bugs fly in and get trapped. We also have blue vein traps, which is a newer method of attracting bees. They're attracted to the blue color and then fall into soapy water into the bowl there. And then old fashioned, just going out and swinging a net about. And so with all of these collection methods, well, particularly the traps, we end up with a variety of insects that get attracted to them. Unfortunately, they don't just attract bees. There's various other especially flies and butterflies and sometimes beetles that get into these traps. So we're left with these samples of a variety of insects. And then normally those will then get stored in alcohol so they can be processed later. So then what do we do with all of these big batches of variety of insects all mixed together? Ideally, every single one of them would get processed, pinned normally, and identified right away. However, that is an incredibly big task, especially the identification. You often need experts for every single different group, whether it's beetles or butterflies or ants or whatever. And so realistically, for many studies, there's a lot of constraints on that. And we focus on a particular group of animals, partially just for limited time, but also sometimes that's just what the research is interested in. So in reality, we have to focus on one. And so in this case, we're running a monitoring program in Pennsylvania, so we're focused on bees. So why is it important to be really good and careful about picking out all the bees from your samples? Well, if we don't sort them out, then they're just missing. Those were data points that are now missing, which is pretty bad when you're doing science, that you're just missing data points. And if we're not doing a good job of sorting things out, we're likely to have data that's um, biased, so we're not finding small or cryptic bee species. And then also, sort of on the flip side, is that if we're picking out some insects that are not bees, that's really not that big of a deal. We're just left with a few extra specimens that are pinned. It's really no big deal if we're accidentally picking some wasps or things. So it's really important to get all of the bees, and it's not really that big of a deal if we're picking out a few things that turn out not to be bees. So if we're going to miss bees from samples, there's two main reasons that can happen, or really, I think only two reasons. And first is that you saw the bee in the sample and you didn't think it was a bee. So you just didn't recognize it as being a bee. You thought it was something else. And then the second reason is you just never saw them. So first, let's deal with the first one, is that you didn't recognize bees, and that may be because you don't have a good sense of what bees look like or what non-bees look like. So to start answering, the question about picking out bees and recognizing bees, let's first answer the question of what is a bee. It's not quite as easy as it seems. In the grand scheme, bees are a group of wasps that evolved to be vegetarian or to eat pollen and nectar around 130 million years ago, and that was around the same time that flowering plants evolved. So it kind of makes sense. Bees are pollinating plants, and they're sort of evolving together around a similar time. So this is an evolutionary tree of part of the Hymenoptera, which is the order of insects that includes bees and wasps, but also ants and a variety of other groups. So this evolutionary tree shows, these nodes here are common ancestors. So there was some species here that then speciated and led to these different groups over time. So each of these branching is a speciation and led to many different groups and many different species. And so if we go through this group, we have this common ancestor here, which includes a variety of different wasps and bees. And if we go down to this group, everything descended from this common ancestor here are all bees. And you might sort of point out, like, there's a lot of things that are closely related to bees. And so there's a bunch of these other wasps here that are quite, in the grand scheme of things, closely related to bees. And actually, the evolutionary history of these is still kind of, being worked out. It's really complicated. And so essentially, bees are a type of wasp, and they're closely related to lots of other wasps like these ones, and it's all quite complicated. So saying evolutionarily what is a bee or not is like not super straightforward, and there's these really closely related lineages. And actually, this most recent study in 2018 suggests this most closely related lineage to bees is a type of wasp that feeds on thrips, these tiny little insects that live in flowers. So it kind of makes sense that a wasp that is already living around flowers and eating these little bugs in flowers might start eating pollen and nectar. So that's the most current hypothesis of how bees came about. So what do all bees have? Well, all bees have two sets of wings. They have a forewing here and a hind wing. So we'll see that some insects don't have that. And then really the most key trait to bees is that they have branched hairs. So instead of these hairs just being straight, they have all these little extra branches that come out. Now that seems pretty straightforward, but actually seeing these branched hairs can be pretty tricky. And there's also some bees where they don't have a lot of hairs and the branching is much harder to spot. But really, branched hairs is the most definitive trait of a bee. So what are some other bee traits or characteristics? Now, these are kind of the ones that often come to mind. Well, bees are hairy. So these bees on the left are really quite hairy, and this is, the quintessential bee tends to be hairy. However, there are many other bees that aren't really so hairy. We'll get into parasitic bees in a bit, but these bees here are both parasitic bees, meaning they don't collect their own pollen, so they don't have the hairs to help them collect pollen. So yes, a lot of bees are hairy, and if you see a hairy, bug like that, it's probably a bee. But it doesn't. If it's not hairy, doesn't mean it's not a bee. How about being black and yellow? Well, we've already seen some photos of black and yellow bees, and many bees are some combination of black and yellow, but many bees are not. We have these bright green ones, we have red and black ones, and a whole bunch of bees that are kind of just like a dark color and are not sort of brightly colored at all. So it's good to sort of realize that bees might not, they're not all looking like honeybees or bumblebees. We have a lot of different shapes and colors. And next, bees are kind of chunky and robust. So this is kind of another quintessential bee. This is a Calides. And you see they just have kind of like a, you know, big abdomen, kind of chunky body. They just look tough. They're robust and kind of thick legs. And that is a common feature of bees. And so compared to their relatives, bees do tend to be sort of more chunky. They're hard-working bugs, but there are many others that don't quite have that thickness to them. So here's a few examples of bees in Pennsylvania that are more waspy. They're just kind of more dainty. So pretty small legs here. These Caliopsis actually, oh no, sorry, I was thinking of Perdita. We'll get to that later. These are sort of bright and kind of waspy. This is another parasitic bee. Doesn't really stand out as being much like a bee. It's more waspy. And then this is another parasitic that's probably the most waspy ones are these Nomata. So I mentioned that bees are a group of wasps that evolved to collect pollen and nectar, and that's where the branching hairs come in. It's good for collecting pollen. And many bees have special pollen collecting hairs or clusters of these hairs called a scopa. And so that is a common feature. So Melisodes here has these enormous hairs on their legs, and you can't even see the hairs because they're all packed with pollen. Andrena, or mining bees, they hold pollen on their legs too, but it's more in their armpits, so their scopa is like closer to their body. And then Megachile and all other bees in the Megachilidae have their scopa under their abdomen. So that's actually really distinctive of that family of bees, is holding pollen under here. And the yellow here is all from the pollen, not the colors of the hairs. So if you see bugs with, hairs covered in pollen, that's a bee, although there's at least a couple exceptions, of course. And oh yeah, so all female bees are the ones that are out collecting pollen. They're doing all the work, gathering pollen to feed their babies. But there are male bees out there, and they are not collecting pollen. They do still visit flowers to drink nectar or find mates and stuff, but they don't typically have these distinctive patches of pollen collecting hairs or scopa. So let's take a closer look at some scopa. These are the amazing photos of the bee monitoring lab in Maryland. So this is a Melisodes, and you see there's just enormous clusters of hair on the hind leg. That's their scopa. This is another bee in the Megachilidae, where I said they have the scopa under their abdomen. So this is a good example of that. However, even bees that do collect pollen and nectar, there are many that don't really have particularly obvious scopa. So these small Ceratina and Lasioglossum are very common bees that, as far as I can tell, don't have any obvious scopa. I'm actually curious how it is they carry pollen, but you'll see them have pollen on their bodies, but not like a big clump of obvious pollen collecting hairs. And then there are bees that lack scopa entirely. So one on the left is a Hylaeus. These bees, they do collect pollen, but they carry it internally in a crop. Like birds have a crop where they store stuff internally. That's what they do. And then this bee on the right is another kleptoparasitic bee. Ones that don't gather their own pollen. They parasitize other bees' nest. And they don't have obvious scopa, and that is actually a common trait of all parasitic bees. There are some that are fuzzy, but probably all the time, or nearly all of the time, parasitic bees do not have scopa probably some exception, but it's a good rule. Then there's one other type of pollen carrying method, which is the pollen basket. Now, only certain groups of bees do this, but honeybees do it, and honeybees do it. Honeybees and bumblebees have pollen baskets. So this is a close-up image of their hind tibia, their hind leg, and it has this really flattened hind leg in this sort of smooth spot in the middle, and then all these hairs branching out. And what these bees do is they gather pollen, and then they wetten it down with their saliva or insect equivalent of saliva to make these wet balls that then stick to the corbicula here. And then this is an example of a bee out collecting pollen that has this big lump of pollen on their hind leg. So if you see that big lump of pollen on their leg that's kind of wet, that's either a honeybee or bumblebee if you're in Pennsylvania at least. So there are other insects that can look a lot like bees, and most of the time these are insects that are actually purposely mimicking bees, because as we know, bees have a stinger. At least female bees do. Male bees don't have a stinger. So these flies evolved to look like bees so that maybe other bugs, other predators won't mess with them. So hoverflies are common flies that tend to look like bees, and they also pollinate flowers, and so they behave similarly to bees. But there are some very definitive traits to know they are not bees. They only have a single set of wings, so not the front wing and the hind wing like bees do, just one pair. And most of the time, not always, they hold their wings in this kind of triangular shape. So sort of see this triangle. So if you see that, bees don't really do that. They tend to fold them over their body. And although bees can although syrphid flies can have pollen all over them, they're not gathering pollen. They're just drinking nectar, and they don't have specialized hairs for carrying pollen. They do not have a scopa. But they can be kind of hairy, and so I think this one even might have pollen on there. They can be kind of covered in pollen, but they don't have that like big cluster of hairs for gathering pollen. Here's a closer look at a syrphid fly. They're really cool looking, and you can see here they this one's not following the rules of having its wings out in a triangle, but or has the wings over their body, but they have these structures called halteres, which are essentially what their hind wing evolved into. They don't have a membranous hind wing. They have these little structures, and they move around and actually are critical to their balance. So they are important, but they're not full wings. The other thing about syrphid flies is they tend to have really skinny legs. Some bees have pretty skinny legs as well, but a lot of bees have quite thick. Kind of remember we talked about bees being chunky and thick. Syrphids are more dainty and soft and have these skinny legs. And then finally, syrphids, as is typical of flies, have just enormous eyes that basically their whole head is eyes. And then they also have these, syrphid flies at least have these stubby, weird little nubs of antennae. Other types of flies have longer antennae, but syrphid flies have these stubby little ones. Where bees have pretty long antennae that have either 12 or 13 segments. Female bees have 12 and male bees have 13 segments. So if you see something you think might be a bee, but it has tiny little antennae, not a bee. But what about wasp? As I said earlier, bees are a type of wasp. And because of that, there are not many like super definitive traits to tell them apart, but there are kind of some tendencies. So in general, wasp tend to have this narrow waist. So I'll point this out here. Between their abdomen and their thorax, they have a really small constriction here most of the time. Sometimes it's really extreme where they can have a really long, really narrowed waist. But in general, wasps have these narrower waist than bees. They're often not that hairy, though in this wasp here does have a lot of hairs, but it's not quite as thick as you might think of as being on bees. They do not have a scopa, or those pollen clusters of pollen carrying hairs. Some wasps will fold their wings lengthwise, So when they're holding them, they kind of fold over like a hot dog bun. Bees don't do that. Some wasps do. Wasp, their coloration of wasp most of the time is not from their hairs. It's from their skin being different colors, though some bees do that as well. And in general, wasps have spiky legs. Almost all wasps are predators, so their legs are for grasping prey, and they have these little spikes. So in this case, there's a little spike on this leg you can see in here. And then bees have this sort of jargony. Bees have a narrow first tarsal segment. So I'll explain that here. So this is a leg of a bee or wasp, and the first big segment of the leg is the femur, and then the second is the tibia. And this whole section down here is like their foot, but it has multiple parts, and each part of the foot is called a tarsus, and collectively they're tarsi. So the first tarsus, the first segment of their foot, essentially, is very skinny in wasp. So these two examples, you can see this first segment is very skinny, a similar thickness to the other segments. Where in bees, that first tarsal segment tends to be fatter. That was very pronounced in this one. However, many bees, it's not that pronounced. So it's not as definitive as it seems in this photo. It can be a lot more subtle, but it's something to look for. Yeah. So some wasps are very definitively not bees. These ones all have the super narrowed waist here and here, and especially in this one. So I don't think anyone would be mistaken these wasps for bees in these different wasp families. However, there are other wasps that are much trickier. So in these four families, Cabronids, Scoliids, Typhoids, Sphecids, they can look very bee-like. And not surprisingly, these are that group in the phylogeny that are closely related to bees. So Cabronids are really tricky. There's a lot of bees that look very similar to this. And they have a vibe that's different, but to be honest, I don't have any, like, personally don't know fully definitive traits. There probably are ones, but I don't know them, and their vibe isn't obvious. These two groups of wasp, the Typhoids and Scoliids, a lot of them actually do collect pollen, and so some of them are actually quite fuzzy. This one's pretty fuzzy, and you can see it's on a flower there. So they can be pretty tricky as well. They tend to have a different vibe, but if you're just thinking that being fuzzy means it's a bee, well, there's some exceptions. However, all this hair here should not be branched hairs. So if you were looking under the microscope, those hairs would not be branched. Some Sphecids are also a bit wasp-like or bee-like, although many Sphecids have this really, really narrow waist and don't look anything like bees, but there's lots of tricky ones out there. So if we're trying to pick out wasps from bees, when we're sorting, we want to be conservative, and if we're not sure a wasp is a bee, then go ahead and go forward and pin it. And so a couple of rules is that if you know what you're looking at and you know what family a wasp is in, which if you haven't studied bugs or wasps is quite unlikely. But if you do happen to know, then, well, yeah, you know that it's not a bee. You can, leave those out and not pin them. And if you don't know what family a wasp is in, and like it, is unambiguous about that tarsal segment thing, and you can't see the hairs, and there's really no other traits that you're certain, I would often be that with the Cabronid wasp. Then just go ahead and pick them out and pin them. It's not a big deal, and you might be surprised how similar some bees and wasps look. Okay, so this is a bit repetitive, but I found these really nice diagrams from this website called ID My Bee. And they just had some nice diagrams to show this stuff. So they said for bees, they have two sets of wings. That front set of wings has 8 or 9 closed cells. So these are the closed cells here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So some wasps will have very different arrangement of their wing venation. And then you might know it's not a bee if it has many more or less than 8 or 9 cells. And then, of course, a front wing and a hind wing. if we're talking about a syrphid fly, only one wing in these little halteres here. There are also some beetles that evolved to mimic bees, and they technically have two sets of wings, but their front set of wings evolved to be this hard shell, what gives beetle their hard, like tank-like shell vibe. It's called an elytra, and then there's a membranous set of wings underneath that. So if you see those hard elytra, not a bee. And there's some traits of the antennae. We talked about the fly antennae, which are very obviously different, but there's some differences with some wasp antennae as well. As mentioned, bees have 12 or 13 segments. This first segment here, and this weird little second segment, and then these sort of more uniform segments here. And if total you count 12 or 13, then you got a bee. Some wasp have, they look really different here, and they can have, for example, this one has 17 total segments. If you're seeing anything more than 12 or 13, not a bee. And then finally, this is that first tarsal segment thing again. If you have this first, you have the femur, tibia, and then the next one, that's part of the foot. The first tarsi is kind of fatter than these other ones. You got a bee. If it's skinny, similar or even smaller than the other ones, probably more likely to be a wasp. Like I said, that one's not super definitive, but it's a tendency. And then finally, the branch tears. That's super definitive if you can see it. So if you see the branch tears, you know it's a bee. If you don't see them, well, they can be really hard to see, and it's harder to be sure. So it's more like a positive affirmation if you know it. If you don't see it, not sure. Okay, so we've gone over a bunch of traits of bees. And now an introduction to all of the bee genera in Pennsylvania. So if I say genera and you don't know what that is, here we go. This is scientific classification. So as scientists, there's millions of species out there, and we need a way to classify all of them. And so to do that, we use this hierarchical system where we have more and more layers of classification. And so here we're starting with kingdom. There actually is one level above that. But if we're in the world of multicellular plants and animals and stuff, we can start with kingdom. So first, all right, it's an animal. Great. We know it's not a plant or a fungi. Then below that, we have arthropoda, which are all of the animals that have exoskeletons and jointed legs, which isn't just insects. It includes crustaceans and arachnids and stuff. All right, now we're down to insect. And then we're to order Hymenoptera, which I mentioned before. That's the group of insects that includes bees and wasps and ants and lots of other things. Super diverse group. And then now that we're in Hymenoptera, we then can go to family Apidae, which is a family of bees. There is a group that's just for bees, but it's kind of one of these intermediate ones that's not as commonly used. It's called Anthophylla. So biologists aren't always fully satisfied with just these levels of hierarchy. They add more, which gets confusing. But anyways, we have family Apidae, which includes bumblebees and honeybees and various other things. And then we have genus. So this is the group we're most interested today. So the genus for bumblebees is Bombus. And then finally, below genus, we have the species name. So you may have heard scientific names. There's always two words. So we have Bombus and Patiens. All bumblebees are Bombus, and then every species has a different name. And so that's the full scientific name of one species is the genus and then the species. So let's talk about the genera of bees. Although before we do that, let's go over the families. So this is from a recent checklist of all of the bees that have currently been found in Pennsylvania by Shelby Kilpatrick. And as we know now, there are 6 families of bees in Pennsylvania. That's all there's probably ever going to be because the 7th bee family is only found in Australia. There are then 46 genera in a total of 437 species that we know of so far. Okay, so let's go over the families. First, we have Apidae. And I made these acronyms or little abbreviations that I'll use later. So Apidae has 17 genera and is the most diverse group in Pennsylvania with 118 species. So this pie chart shows the species. That's the most diverse group. Next, we have Halictidae, or the sweat bees, which has 110 species and 9 genera. Some very diverse genera in there. Next, we have Endrenidae with 100 species and only 4 genera. Now we have Megachilidae, which has 12 genera and 81 species. Callididae, only 2 genera and 24 species. And the least diverse Melididae with 4 species, and 2 genera. So that's our hierarchy of bees. We have 6 families, 46 genera, over 400 species. So 400 species is a lot to tackle. 6 families is not too hard. So the middle ground is the genera. So if we can know all the genera, we're actually knowing the natural history of the bees pretty good. But before I get into all of the bees, one easy way to start classifying things in a less hierarchical taxonomic way is just how big they are. It's a common way to look at things. So I made 3 categories: large, medium, and small. So large is greater than 15 millimeters, medium 10 to 15, small less than 10. So unless you're super familiar with working with millimeters and centimeters, that may not be super meaningful to you. But as a point of reference, this is a dime here. And a dime is about 18 millimeters wide. So we can always kind of think of that in context. If we're bigger than a dime, we know we're large, or if we're like similar to the size of a dime, we're going to be in the large category. If we're somewhere like half to 3/4 of a dime, then we're probably medium. If we're less than half, we're probably going to be small. So to really bring that home, I took a bunch of photos of bees in Pennsylvania sitting on dimes. So starting with the big category, we have a bumblebee here, and the largest bees in Pennsylvania, this bee, Xylocopa, or carpenter bee, and they're definitely in the large category, like is bigger than a dime. Medium is, we have the ubiquitous honeybee, definitely falls into the medium category. Some of them approach, if you had a queen, it would be large, but in general, they're medium. This is a squash bee, genus Eucera, or it used to be called Peponapis. So that's what medium bees look like. And then small, some really tiny ones out there. This is an Agachlora, or green sweat bee. They're sort of about 8 millimeters. And then this is a Ceratina, or a small carpenter bee. So actually this bee, some of the smallest ones and some of the largest ones are relatively closely related. They're both carpenter bees, but we have the big carpenter bees and the small carpenter bees. And these small Ceratina are super abundant, and they're definitely a group that if you're not familiar with them, you might never think they were a bee. So with these size categories, I came up with 7 visual categories of bees. Now, these are not like real biological groups. They're just ones I made up because I thought they would be helpful. They're not like evolutionary related or anything like that. They're just visual groups. So first is large bees that are really hairy. Second is medium-sized bees that are also really hairy. So both of these groups are like probably universally everyone would see them and be like, well, those are bees, obvious. But then we have some medium bees that are waspy. They're not hairy, and they're kind of like pointy and not as robust sometimes. They're potentially going to be confused with wasp. Then we have these medium or small bees that are bright green metallic, or some of them can be blue. Then we have medium-sized bees that are dark, and they tend to, this group, they're also normally pretty hairy. Then we have small and waspy. So these are, again, often brightly colored and not very hairy. And then finally, small and dark. This is Ceratina, again, down here in the corner. This small and waspy and small or dark are definitely the trickiest ones. Okay, so now we're going to go through all of the bee genera and break them down into these visual categories. And I took a bunch of notes and I came up with a few little factoids about each one. This could take all day if I had too much, but a few things so we have something to learn about each of these groups. So first is bumblebees. And I mentioned before that bumblebees have this corbicula, which is this flattened hind leg that can carry balls of pollen. They are one of the few, well, there's not a whole lot of groups of bees here that are social. Most bees are solitary, but bumblebees are social, borderline eusocial, which means they, like some of the bees, give up their possibility to reproduce. Which I believe they are eusocial. Some bumblebees are parasitic. They lay their eggs in other bumblebee nests, and they can have colonies up to about 500 individuals. And total, there's about 28 bumblebee species in eastern North America. So moving on to Xylocopa, they're the biggest bees in Pennsylvania, and they can look similar to bumblebees, but they have this shiny butt. So that can distinguish them. They also don't have the corbicula on their hind legs. They, since they're called carpenter bees, they do nest in wood, so they burrow holes into wood. And they're somewhat semi-social. They're also known for something called nectar robbing. They're so big they can't fit into a lot of flowers, so they'll chew a hole in the bottom of flower and just steal the nectar without getting any of the pollen. So that's normally considered bad for the plant because they're not going to get pollinated that way. So they're kind of rude. All right, moving on to Telothrix. I will admit I haven't heard a lot of these bee genera said out loud, so please do not assume I know how to pronounce all these correctly. You know, they're weird Latin and Greek, so sometimes biologists don't even agree on how to pronounce them. So don't get held up too much on pronunciation. I'm going to assume this is Telothrix. They're pretty large, and now we're getting into fully solitary bees. They build their own singular nest. They really like the mallow plant family, or the Malvaceae. So a lot of bees are generalists. They'll kind of visit whatever, but a lot of them are specialists as well. So they love mallow flowers. And most of the species have this light patch on their face, which can be somewhat indicative of that genus. Although there are lots of other male bees that have light patches as well. And they like gathering water. Sometimes you'll see them gathering water because they nest in the ground, and they'll use that water to soften up the soil before they dig their burrows. All right, moving on to Savastra. Many of them are specialists, and they really like sunflowers, Helianthus, or evening primrose, genus Anothera. They're quite colorful. They have really long antennae, and they, again, nest in the ground. I'm going to stop saying which ones nest in the ground because almost all bees nest in the ground. It's kind of amazing. Next, we have Habropoda. These are also specialists, and they particularly like blueberry flowers, which this one is on a blueberry flower in that photo. And given that they like blueberry flowers, they are active mostly just in the spring because that's when the flowers are active. And they can be very similar to Anthophora, which is a genus that'll come up in the next page. You have to look at the wing venation to tell them apart. And here we have, I don't know how to pronounce this one, Dionomia. These are a really large sweat bee, which is quite unusual. Most sweat bees are really small. But these bees love the sunflower family, Asteraceae, and most Asteraceae flower later in the summer or even into the fall, so that's when these bees are active. And they also nest really deep in the soil. So they're one group that can sometimes survive plowing of fields because they're below the plow level. So they can do well in some agricultural areas. But as I said, so many bees nest in the ground. Plowing soil is like probably the best way to kill thousands or millions of bees. So we have one species here that I really couldn't fit into any of my 7 categories. It's large, but it's not really hairy, and it's, it just doesn't fit. But it's a rare species in Pennsylvania. And if you ever see any ones that have these kind of pearly, yellowy bands that are like on the skin, not hairs, it's got to be this species. And they nest in the ground as well, sometimes in enormous nesting aggregations. All right, moving on to medium and hairy. First, we have Eucera, which is a pretty diverse group. A bunch of different genera recently got lumped into Eucera based on like the evolutionary history, including Peponapis, which is the squash bee. And that's what's, that's not, actually I forget what species that is. But one unique thing about Eucera is they have a very pronounced clypeus, which is basically their nose, like this spot between their eyes. It kind of bulges out. So that's somewhat distinctive of that genera. All of them nest in the ground. And as I mentioned, squash bees are super specialists that are in that group. They're not all specialists. All right, on to Melisodes. I really like Melisodes. They are really, really fast flying bees, and they tend to be active like in mid to late summer. And again, it's because they super like the sunflower family, the Asteraceae. Males have enormous antennae, so they're often called longhorn bees. And yeah, they like Asteraceae. All right, now we have honeybees, and I put a little star here because honeybees are an invasive non-native species in Pennsylvania and all of North America, although they're very important for agriculture and are economically very valuable. They're not particularly good for the environment, or not good for the environment at all in most cases, because they compete with other bees. They can spread diseases and viruses and stuff. So anyways, so that's honeybees. However, they are super interesting. They're amazing. They are eusocial. They have enormous hives. They also have a corbicula, the flattened hind leg here, like bumblebees do. So it's only in Pennsylvania, it's only bumblebees and honeybees that have that. And one factoid, you could talk all day of factoids about honeybees, but one is that the queen honeybee that's in the nest, the only one that's laying eggs, can lay up to 1 to 2,000 eggs a day. So that's a big reason why honeybees are incredibly abundant, and in many cases the most abundant bee you'll see in lots of places. Next we have Melicta. This is a parasitic species, so they lay their eggs in other bees' nest. I think it's in Anthophora that they lay their eggs in. Actually, I probably wrote that down. Yes, in Anthophora. And there's only ever been there's only one record that we have of a Melicta in Pennsylvania. So maybe they could spread to here, but they're so far incredibly rare. And they're one of the few parasitic species that's super fluffy, so they don't really look like other parasitic bees. Next, we have Anthophora. They're also really fast, and they have a super long tongue, and they nest in the ground, but they like nesting in like banks, like on the edges of rivers, like where they can dig in horizontally. Next, we have Calides, and they tend to have white and gray or brown hairs. But if you see this kind of white or gray hairs, that's somewhat unique of that group. And they're called cellophane bees because they line their burrows in the ground with this like waterproof membrane. There are other bees that do that, but they're kind of unique in that. And they also have these kind of heart-shaped face. You can't see it too much in this photo, but their eyes kind of come closer together down near their mouth, which can help distinguish them from Andrena, which are otherwise quite similar. So we got more medium hairy. Some megachile are fit into this category. It's a super diverse group, and they look very different, but some of them are medium size and quite hairy, especially this one. This is an invasive species called a resin bee. Anyways, they will all have, well, this one doesn't really, but most megachile will have the scopal hairs, obvious scopal hairs under their abdomen, which is definitive of that family of bees. And they tend to nest in cavities and in the ground. They're also called leafcutter bees because they'll cut pieces of leaves and use that to block up their different nest cells. So they'll pack up one cell with pollen and lay an egg, and then make a wall of leaves and then go to the next one. So it's possible to see them flying around with leaves in their mouth. And if you see these like perfectly round cut or like half semicircles cut out of a leaf, that's from a leafcutter bee. Next we have Lythurgus. This also has the asterisk next to this because there's only one species in Pennsylvania, and it is an introduced species from the Mediterranean region. And they are specialists on a type of thistle, Centaurea, that type of thistle, which is also invasive. And so they're kind of potentially, an invasive plant helps the invasive bee get around. From what I could tell, they've only been found in North America so far in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So it'll be pretty interesting to see if there's evidence of them spreading further. Next, we have Melita, and they are specialists on vaccinium or blueberries. And so that also means they're mostly around in the spring, and they tend to be pretty rare. And finally, we have Andrena. They can be very common in the spring. I was out just the other day at an apple tree, and there were like thousands of them. And they nest in the ground. Some are specialists, some are not. And they're incredibly diverse. There's about 500 species of Andrena in North America. And they do have a distinctive trait. Can't really see it in this photo, but it's called a facial fovea, which is this like depression on their face that has little hairs in it. So it's kind of like a vertical eyebrow. And a lot of them have this kind of shiny butt. All right, we're going to move on to a new category, which is medium and waspy. So now we're getting into more that have this P next to it. So I put that there if they are a parasitic or kleptoparasitic species, meaning they lay their eggs in other bees' nests. So we have Epiolus, which is a parasitic species in the Apidae family or parasitic genus. They tend to be pretty chunky, kind of thick and chunky, and they parasitize Calides, which we just heard of in the previous section. They're not fuzzy at all, and they can be pretty similar to the next one, which is Tripeolus. Perhaps not surprising given the similarities in name. Tripeolus are also parasitic, and they mostly parasitize Melisodes or Eucera. So they're out later in the year, which is because those bees are out at that time. You'll normally see them flying around the ground because they're parasitizing ground nesting bees, so they're looking for the nest. But they don't have a nest of their own, so at night they'll cling to stems of plants. So if you go out either late in the evening or early in the morning, you can sometimes see them clinging on with their mandibles, like chomped on to like a stick or a blade of grass or something. Next, we have Anthidium. These are not parasitic, but I still put them in the waspy category just because they kind of have a waspy look to them. And there are 3 species in Pennsylvania. 1 is native and 2 of them are not. I believe this is the non-native species in the photo here. And they're called wool carder bees, and that's because they gather hair either from plant trichomes or from mammals, and they use that to line their nest. And the invasive species are kind of a concern because they can be super aggressive and thought they might be negatively influencing some of the native species. And next we have, here's one I don't know how to pronounce at all, Coleoxys, something like that. There's another parasitic bee, and they're very definitive. Basically, if you see this pointy butt, that's them. And they are parasitic mostly of Megachile, and that's the family they're in, or other bees in the Megachilidae. Black and shiny, pointy butt, quite distinctive. All right, we're moving on to the metallic bees. Now, there are a bunch that look incredibly similar, and they all have pretty similar life histories as well. So first we have Agapestomon, and they can nest in aggregate groups, so you can see them all nesting together. And they're also, it's called multivoltine, just a big word to say they have multiple generations per year. A lot of the bees we talked about before only have 1 generation per year, the solitary ones at least. And they're generalist, and from an identification standpoint, they have a little like sharp ridge along this sort of back part of their thorax, which when you look at them under a microscope is pretty definitive. Next, we have Agachlora, which are a bit smaller than the other green bees. There's only 1 species in Pennsylvania. They nest mostly in dead logs or rotting logs, and they're also a multivoltine that can have 2 to 3 generations per year. Agachlorella, they're solitary or social. They can kind of sometimes be one or the other. And like the others, they'll nest in the ground, generalist, similar ecology. Now we have Agachloropsis. Some of these are social, and some of them are even eusocial, and they nest in the ground as well. But because they're social, their populations kind of build up in the year. So later in the summer or the fall, they can be even more abundant. And finally, the last one that is not a green sweat bee is Osmia, or mason bees, and they are active almost exclusively in spring, and they are cavity nesters, and they're called mason bees because they patch up their cavities that they nest in with mud. And they're pretty robust. They're kind of round and chunky, and they're really important for a lot of crops because they pollinate a lot of fruit trees, like apples and cherries and stuff like that. And because they're really good at that, there's a few species that have been brought in on purpose to help pollinate some of those fruit crops. All right, we're moving on to a new category, and which is medium and dark. So they're still somewhat sizable, but they're a very dark color. Okay, so we got Melatoma. This is a medium one in the Apidae family. They particularly like plants in the morning glory family, especially Ipomea. And they nest in all sorts of different types of places. They have long tongues, and they often have this kind of black and white look to them with little white stripes. Now we have Hopolitis, which is a little Megachilidae. They're active mostly in the spring, and they're kind of shiny with light hairs. Um, and they also nest in a wide variety of places, cavities and stuff like that. Now we're seeing Megachile again. As I mentioned, they're super variable in the way they look. So some of them also have this kind of dark look to them. As I said before, they nest in cavities. They're leafcutter bees. Now we have Halictus. These can be super abundant in many places, and they vary in how social they are. Some of them are somewhat social, some are more solitary. And even sometimes the same species can vary in how social they are depending on the environmental conditions. So given that they're semi-social, they're basically active throughout much of the year. And they're super generalist, as most bees that have a active throughout the year are. And they do almost always have these sort of stripes on their abdomen. They always have something there. I don't know if they're always lightly colored, but that's a trait of them. And finally, we have Macropus. This is the second genus that's in the Melitidae. They have a very kind of amazing natural history. So they are specialists on loosestrife flowers as the only flowers or pretty much the only flowers they visit. And part of the reason is that they gather oils from those flowers. Those flowers don't actually produce nectar; they only produce oil. And so they have special scopa or hairs that allow them to collect these oils, which they sort of provision their nest with. And so they're very rare, hard to find, and their range is limited to where there are these loosestrife flowers, various plants in that genus. Okay, we're moving on to some trickier ones, which are now in the small and waspy category. You'll notice that lots of these are parasitic species, like this first one, which is Nomata. They can be pretty abundant early in the spring, and that's because they mostly parasitize Andrena, which are also spring bees, and they are really, really diverse. There's about 300 species in eastern North America. So that probably goes along with Andrena being super diverse. So as lots of species of Andrena evolved, you got lots of species of Nomata evolving. These are, I think, probably the most waspy looking bees in Pennsylvania. They can be pretty tricky, but once you know what they look like, they do mostly look pretty similar. They have this red or yellow. They vary, but they kind of look like that. So if you recognize that, you can pick them out. Next, we have these tiny little bees called Holcopasides. Again, I'm probably saying that wrong. They are active mostly in the summer, and they parasitize Calliopesis, which we'll see in a bit. The species here are all red and black like this, and they're just like really, really tiny and cute, and I hope to see one day. Next, we have Sphecoides, which is a parasitic sweat bee, and they parasitize other ground nesting bees, like mostly other sweat bees, but some other things as well. And they have this red abdomen, pretty distinctive, and apparently they have a wide head. I haven't seen that, but red abdomen, wide head, you're pretty likely to be a Sphecoides. Now we have Paradita. Even though they look similar to some of these parasitic species, they are not parasitic. But they are kind of that small waspy. They tend to have this black and yellow or black and green, and they're active mostly later in the summer or the fall. They particularly like sunflower family, Asteraceae again. And their abdomens are like particularly flat, and when they're stored as a specimen, they like almost like contract, like flatten completely. And they also tend to have like yellow or green markings on their face. Next, we have Caliopsis, which I mentioned a bit ago, because these parasitize these. How convenient. They're right on top of each other. So they're yellow and black, and they also have these markings on their face. And they particularly like small flowers in the bean family, the Fabaceae. For whatever reason, we captured lots of male Caliopsis. I don't. Maybe the males really like the traps we're using or something. I don't know. And finally, we have Hylaeus. These are, again, not parasitic. They do gather their own pollen and nectar, but they have very little or no obvious hair. And that's because they carry their pollen internally. I mentioned that before. Their host association is not that well known because you like can't get the pollen off of their body, but it's thought they like Rosaceae flowers. And actually, the only ones I've ever caught, which isn't that many of them, but I've caught them off blackberry flowers and apple flowers. So that totally fits that they like things in the rose family. They also have markings on their face, which can be, there's not that many bees that look like that. They have markings on their face. So they're pretty easy to spot once you know them. And then continuing with small and waspy, we have Anthedellum, something like that. It's related to Anthidium, which we saw before. So they look pretty similar. They're chunky. They're known for hovering really good. A lot of bees don't hover that well, but they hover really good. And the males will patrol like an area to kind of protect it from other bees. And they're cavity nesters, mostly active in the summer. Now we have pseudo Anthidium, and they are an introduced species. And beyond that, I didn't write down any facts. So you'll have to look up facts about pseudo Anthidium on their own, but they're quite small, and it's an introduced species. Now, to add to the more confusing names that are something similar to Anthidium, we also have Para-Anthidium. They are active mostly in the summer as well. They really like the sunflower family. Again, seems like a common theme. Lots of bees like things in the sunflower family. And they nest in sandy soils, often in aggregations, and there's only one species in Pennsylvania. All right, now we're down to Stelis. This is, again, a parasitic species, and they parasitize mostly other bees in the Megachilidae, and they're pretty rare. They got this black and orange markings, and when they lay their eggs in other bees' nests, they'll hatch and then kill the larva and then eat the pollen, which is sort of a pretty typical thing of parasitic bees. Okay, we made it. We're on to our last category, which is small and dark. First is Lasioglossum. And so these are incredibly abundant small sweat bees. And a lot of them have this kind of metallic sheen to them. And they can vary from being completely solitary to completely eusocial. So they kind of do it all. They tend to nest in the ground and in wood. They're really diverse, about 300 species in North America. Super common, and they're all, well, most of them are generalists, but there's so many, they do all sorts of different things. Next, we have Ceratina, the small sweat bees, which have come up a couple times already. They're quite abundant and kind of this shiny metallic blue-gray color. I guess not gray, blue-black. They have this kind of pointy, their butt kind of comes to a point. You can see it a little bit in this photo, but it's more distinctive when you're looking down at them. So once you know the shape of them, they're quite distinctive. The tip of their butt is kind of like a little Hershey's kiss. And they nest in pithy stems of like dead plant stems. So a good reason to keep dead plant stems around because they're nesting sites for Ceratina and other bees as well. And they overwinter as adults, which is pretty unique. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. There's also some of them are like semi-social as well. And then other Ceratina in the world I read, there's some of them that can reproduce asexually, which is pretty cool. I don't know if the ones here do that, but. And then we have Colostoma, which is a small bee in the Megachilidae. They have long cylindrical bodies, They're thought to be probably specialists, but not well known. They also nest in cavities, and they're mostly out in the spring and summer. All right, now we have Proto-Andrena. I had a hard time finding facts on these. I think there have only a few been collected in Pennsylvania. They're small and dark. They often have like little markings on their face. And again, they nest in the ground, and they also have this like waterproof membrane wallpaper stuff that Calides does. Now we have Hyriades. Again, probably saying that wrong. It's a Megachilidae, so they got the scopal hairs under their abdomen. They're black, kind of long and skinny, cigar shaped. They nest in cavities and very small and have these sort of white stripes on their abdomen normally. And then finally, perhaps maybe the rarest of all of them that we talked about, Epiloides, which is a tiny parasitic bee of Macropus, which is a rare bee on its own. Macropus are the ones, if I remember right, Macropus are the ones that only feed on the loosestrife flowers, so they're sort of restricted range already. And so these bees parasitize those narrow range bees, and they're really uncommon. They were thought they might be extinct, maybe. They hadn't been collected in a really, really long time. Not too long ago, someone found one in Michigan. So they might be declining. They're probably really rare. So maybe someone will find one of those. All right, so the final point is just to kind of drive home the point of how small some of these bees are. So when we're looking at Lasioglossum, this is a blueberry flower. So if you know the size of a blueberry flower, they're pretty small. This bee climbed all the way inside of it, no problem. So they're very tiny. Here's a colostoma on like a little daisy fleabane. It's a very small flower there. And here's the Ceratina again, also on something like a daisy fleabane. So just so it's kind of drilled in your head, there's a lot of bees that are quite tiny and dark color. And a little bit more, here's a close-up of the Ceratina on a dime, and then one of those little Lasioglossums on a dime. So yeah, they can be pretty tricky to pick out of a batch of specimens. So let's get back to the story about, or the lessons about picking bees out of batches of specimens. So now that we know what all a variety of bees look like, we can hopefully be good at spotting them and knowing a bee when we see it. But then we have to still look through our samples carefully enough so that we see them even if we know how to recognize them. So the first thing is, we have a context like this where you have a bunch of specimens in alcohol normally, and we need to pick out the bees. Seems easy, not so much. There's several bees in this photo. Got one here, got one here, got one here, big bee here. So they can blend in pretty well sometimes. So I came up with basically a protocol to do this as carefully and methodically as possible, so we're finding all of our bees. So here we go. Number one, get out 3 dishes, petri dishes or something similar, and then pour your whole sample of specimens into one of them. Then we're going to pick out the big bees and put them in a second dish. So just start with the easy ones. Then we're going to pick out all of our other big stuff that we know is not a bee, that's just kind of taken up space, and put them into a third dish. So that'll be our bycatch dish. And then in your dish that's just all of your small stuff that probably still has bees still in there, move all of them from one side to the other one at a time. So you look at every single thing and pick out anything that might be a bee, and then inspect them under a microscope to make sure that everything you picked out is a bee. So I'm actually going to, if any of that didn't make sense, we're now going to go through it with illustrations. So you have your 3 dishes. You start with your whole sample here, and then this is going to be your bees, and this is going to be your not bees. So if we have a big sample like this, we're first going to pick out our big bees. So we go here, all of our big bees, those are easy. The next we have everything that's left after you picked out the big bees. So now let's pick out all the big stuff that isn't a bee, obviously. So we'll go from a batch that looks like this to this. All right, we have less to look at now. And the reason for doing that is it just clears up space. There's less places for little bees to hide. So now this step, which is you have all of your small stuff here, and we're going to sort of cut your dish in half. In this case, I just put it on top of a piece of paper with a line. You could draw a line on your petri dish too, whatever works for you. And then methodically move each of your specimens, sliding them over and inspecting them as you do it, and picking out any bees as you do it. It seems obnoxious, and it is, but we want to make sure we have eyes on every single little specimen as we go. Another reason for doing that is like insects tend to kind of cling to each other because they're spiky legs and stuff. So you want to make sure you don't have like a cluster of bugs that then just has like a bee stuck in it. So if we move them all one at a time, we kind of solve that problem. So you'll inspect everything. Yeah, and then if you see anything that you're not positive is a bee or a wasp at this stage, just pick it out. Anything that's a bee or an ambiguous wasp goes to your dish. So that step of moving them and inspecting everything, if you have a dissecting scope where you can zoom out pretty far, that you can do that under the scope. The scope I have doesn't zoom out that far, so it's not very helpful for that step. So I just do it by eye. Using like a hand lens or a magnifying glass can help with that. Okay, so we're going to look at some examples of bees in liquid, and they'll kind of progressively get harder. So starting looking in liquid, well, that's a honeybee. That is pretty dang easy. And here we have Agachlora. Some people might not notice that as a bee, but now we know there's shiny green bees. Sure. And this is a wasp of some sort. I don't think any bees have these curly antennae, but as far as I know. All right, so now we have serotinin. Actually, you can kind of see that little Hershey kiss butt in this one, kind of good. And then this is a syrphid, or a hoverfly. And most distinctively, they have these tiny little antennae and enormous eyes. Once you know what syrphids look like, they're quite easy to tell from bees when you look close. So there is a lazyglosm in this photo. Do you see it? That sweat bee is right here. And you'll see that a lot of these sweat bees, they'll kind of curl up. So you don't always get a good look at their full outline. You got to kind of realize they'll kind of curl up into a ball, which is kind of annoying, but that's what they do. Okay, do you see a bee in this photo? Here's a bee right here. So it just has that bee, kind of chunky. These are all flies. I don't know. They just kind of look like flies. I don't know. Once you get to know them, you'll just realize that a bee looks like a bee and a fly looks like a fly. Okay. See a bee in this photo? These are all photos that I took through a microscope, so they're not great, but it kind of more represents more like what you would potentially see. So we got a bee right here. Probably a little lazyglosm again. Okay, there's two bees in this photo. You see them? So this can be a little tricky because we have this iridescent green bug here, but that is a fly. One set of wings, big eyes, similar iridescence though to some of the green bees. And here we have an iridescent green sweat bee. And again, a lot of those really curl up. So you can't sort of know that you're going to see like the same outline of a bee that can curl up into a ball. And we got another little sweat bee here. All right, I think this is the final test. How many bees do you see? I challenge you to pause for a second and try to count how many bees. Okay, you paused. You've tested yourself. We're going to reveal all the bees in this photo. There are 6. And here they all are. I believe they're probably all little lazyglosm sweat bees. And they're all mixed in among these flies. And this one's a bit obscured, but that's one as well. So it's a little tricky. Imagine if this was with lots more bugs around. And that's why we move them one at a time through, because when they're all kind of clustered together, it makes it a lot harder. Okay, so what we have now is your whole batch of specimens that you've moved from the left to the right in this case. And here's all of our big bees we picked out. And here's all the small bees that I picked out. So the next thing is then to take all the bees that you picked out. You probably don't need to look at these under a scope because those are easy relatively. But some of these you might want to look at to really see if they're bees or not. And I pulled out a couple here that I know are not bees. So when you're looking at more individualized specimens, we want to look at under the scope so that we can really get a good look at them. We're never going to see branched hairs or tarsal segments or all that type of stuff without a microscope. So here's a couple examples of specimens that might be mistaken for bees. Here we have the syrphid fly. I think all the times we've gone over syrphids, they're probably pretty easy at this point. The little giant eyes and the short antennae. And you can even see the halt hair in this one. But here's the trickier ones: is all these wasps. Um, these are probably tapheids or scoliids, and some of these do collect pollen, and they're just pretty dang similar. I mean, even the wing venation, it looks a little different to me, but it's like got a similar vibe. Like this one also seems to have a relatively chunky first tarsal segment. It doesn't really follow that rule. I mean, it does kind of look like a wasp to me. It's got a pretty narrow waist, but like I couldn't say why exactly. Probably the main reason I know that it's a wasp is that I've looked at photos now, and you have two of all of the bee genera that are in Pennsylvania, and there's just no bee that looks quite like this. We know there's no mata that's a similar shape, but they're kind of red and orange. So it's kind of, once you know what the possibilities are, this just doesn't like fit anything that's out there. I also not sure if any bees have this big and bold of a stigma. That's the dark part on the wing. Anyways, I feel like I'm confident that this is a wasp, but like I said, I couldn't point to a single trait of why. Actually, it'd be interesting to count the antennal segments. Maybe it has more than 12. Anyways, similar to this one, it's definitely waspy. It's got narrow waist, um, not hairy. If you were to inspect these hairs really closely under the scope, you could probably see that they weren't branched, and that would be another sort of piece of evidence. But the thing is, if you look at the hairs really close on Nomata, for example, they are branched, but they're pretty hard to see. So, anyways, I think if you look through all those traits and you're familiar now as you are with all of the bee genera that exist, you can pretty confidently take wasps like this and not pin them because you know they're not bees. But if you're ever not positive, just pin them. Okay, so now if we have all of our bees that we know are all bees, we're ready to move on to the next step, which is to wash and pin them. And I've made other videos showing all those steps. So in the end, we'll end up with a beautiful batch of specimens like that we know are all bees and that we haven't missed any bees, and we're all good and all fine and beautiful loveliness all around. Okay, I'm rambling now. I hope that wasn't too long. And I hope that is interesting. And that is all I got. And I'll leave you with a bunch of beautiful Melisodes hanging out on some New England aster. Goodbye.